Today for reading, our story is going to be The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. And guess what? It is written and illustrated by Beatrix Potter, the same author illustrator that wrote The Tale of Peter Rabbit that we read yesterday. Beatrix Potter wrote this story. And remember the characters from yesterday, Peter Rabbit, the mother, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Mr. McGregor? Well, Beatrix Potter drew and painted pictures from real life, and then she added imaginary elements such as clothing to them. So if you look at the pictures, she actually painted these pictures of a rabbit, and then she drew the imaginary things like the coat and the shoes on them. And just like yesterday, The Tale of Benjamin Bunny is going to be a fantasy. It's in the genre fantasy. And that means that the people or the animals in the story do things they can't do in the real world, and that the things couldn't really happen, and that they take place in a make-believe place. Again, we're going to be talking about rules and how rules keep us safe. That's what you need to be thinking about as your essential question. You're going to be using the comprehension strategies, making connections. So you're going to make connections between your own experiences to the events and the illustrations in the story. And also, you could also make connections between this story and another story. And you're also going to be using clarifying. And remember that clarifying helps you understand what you're reading better by stopping to figure out anything that you might think is confusing. All right, so let's go ahead and read The Tale of Benjamin Bunny. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along. Okay, now this is a good time to stop and clarify something, because a word that we don't know is here. What's a gig? A gig. Now, if I have to, sometimes you can figure it out by what's going on in the story. So it says a gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. So I know that a gig is something that you drive, but I'm not sure what it is. So I can look it up and find out that a gig is a horse-drawn carriage, like people drove back in the 1800s. Now, remember, the story is written long ago. So now, when we're thinking about it, a horse-drawn carriage was coming along the road. A gig was coming along the road. All right, so make sure you're understanding the words that you read. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and a jump to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins. And guess who they were? Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. So here we can make a connection between this story and the story that we read yesterday. These are the same characters. We heard about Mr. McGregor and now the rabbits that we learned about yesterday. Mrs. Rabbit earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffetees. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly, and he was dressed in a red cotton handkerchief. Okay, so now we already connected these characters, and we know from yesterday Peter was the naughty one, right? Peter was the naughty, and Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail were the good bunnies who listened to their mom. Peter, said little Benjamin in a whisper, who has got your clothes? Peter replied, the scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden. Now, let's think about what happened to Peter's clothes. Do you remember in the story that we read yesterday? He lost his shoes and the potatoes and the cabbages, and his coat got stuck too. So he had to leave all of his clothes behind. So a scarecrow is like a big doll on a stick that farmers make to scare away birds. So I think Mr. McGregor has taken Peter's clothes that he lost in the garden and made a scarecrow with it. Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old hat of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night, there was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the hat, but it was too big for him. All right. So have you ever tried on anything that was too big for you, like Benjamin Bunny does here with Mr. McGregor's hat? It's kind of floppy. Can you kind of picture that in your head and think about what it might be like? Now, again, I don't think they're really following the rules here because they shouldn't be in that garden again. Then he suggested that they should fill the handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He should like to go home. Presently, he dropped half the onions. Okay, so you remember, let's make that connection, what happened to Peter the last time he was in that garden and why he might not be very comfortable there, right? He got kind of sick from eating too much. He got chased by Mr. McGregor, and he lost all of his clothes and ended up getting sick because he hid in that watering can, and he was damp and cold. Little Benjamin led the way along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps, cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. This was what those little rabbits saw around that corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then, in half a minute, less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon. But still, the cat sat upon the basket. At length, there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was looking for his son. Okay, so wait a minute here. This is a good time to stop and clarify. So the little bunny was Benjamin Bunny, but this is old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. This is his dad. Because sometimes kids are named after their fathers or their mothers. So Benjamin Bunny must have been named after his father, old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall and on to the top of the cat, and pushed it off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too little. Also, he could not understand how the cat had shut herself up inside the greenhouse. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with bunches of herbs. Oh, I went the wrong way because we need to talk about vocabulary. So we'll have to go back to the beginning of our story To find our first vocabulary word. I think it was on the very first page. There it is. It's the word relations. And it says, Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and a jump to call upon his relations.
Relations. Plural form of relation. A person who belongs to the same family. A relative. My brother and I are relations. We are part of the same family. Relations.
So Benjamin Bunny went to call upon his relations, which were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, Peter, and his aunt, right? All right, let's look for our next word. It's the word tumble. There it is. He came around the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter.
Tumbled. A form of the word tumble. To fall helplessly. The rocks tumbled down the hill. Tumbled.
All right, tumbled, kind of to fall helplessly. So he kind of stumbled or tumbled upon him. All right, the next word is the word should. There it is. Then he suggested that they should fill their handkerchief with onions.
Should. A word used to say that something is a good idea. We should do our homework. It is a good idea. Should.
Okay, should is meant to say that something is a good idea. In this case, I don't think should is a good idea. I think that Benjamin thinks that it's a good idea that they should fill their handkerchief with onions as a present for the aunt. All right, one more vocabulary word today, and it was the word worse. Peter heard noises worse than ever.
Worse. More frightening or unpleasant. This week's storm was worse. More trees fell in this week's storm. Worse.
All right, so worse means more frightening than ever, right? So Peter was very nervous and heard all of these noises even worse than before. Now, you were supposed to be thinking, how do rules keep us safe? Well, these little guys didn't follow the rules and they got themselves into a very unsafe situation and had to be rescued. I will be sure to include the discussion starters so that you can talk about the tale of Benjamin Bunny some more with your big person.